Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Jordan Boyle. I'm an associate professor at the School of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Leeds in England. And it's a real pleasure to have been invited to speak at this interesting forum. I'm also taking part in a panel discussion that I'm quite looking forward to. Nice to sort of virtually and asynchronously meet you all. So the topic of my talk today is going to be around biologically inspired swarm robotics. And I think that this is, potentially interesting to this forum because I think it could present a good and attractive solution for environmental monitoring in the future. Okay, so swarm robotics, as the name sort of implies, is very much takes inspiration from swarms in nature. So, things like honeybees, ants, termites. All of these are relatively simple animals which live together communally and essentially cooperate in quite complex ways in order to achieve things that they certainly could not achieve individually, compensate for their small size and somewhat limited capabilities. And a lot of this emergent behavior that we see in swarms comes by virtue of communication between these organisms, which is mediated in various different ways. So like bees do little dances to tell each other, the direction to good sources of food. Ants do it more using pheromone trails that they lay on the ground. But yeah, there's always some sort of a local communication between the individual organisms. So in terms of the key sort of features of swarms, I was going to call these defining features, but that's maybe not quite true because you don't necessarily need to have all of these to call it a swarm. Some of them, though, are, I think, essential. So in order for it to be a swarm, you need there to be multiple agents, multiple robots or multiple animals. And I don't know, I feel like at least 10, would be required to make it a swarm. And I mean, in biological swarms, there's many more than that, thousands. It's just that we struggle to make thousands of robots. I think another sort of non-negotiable feature of swarms is that there is no centralized control. So in robotics, at least, you could have one main computer or something that was planning what all of the robots should be doing, making all of the decisions, and then just sort of sending commands wirelessly to individual robots. I don't really think we could have that in nature. But yeah, to me, that doesn't really count as a swarm because it's there's this one sort of overarching intelligence making all the decisions. So a swarm should have multiple agents with no centralized control. Typically, the individual agents need to be simple and cheap to produce biologically, in terms of ants and bees having lots of offspring, or cheap to produce, technologically. If you want to have a swarm of 100 robots, then they need to be fairly affordable individually. To compensate for the lack of centralized control, you're typically going to have some short-range agent-to-agent communication. So the individual bees can talk to each other. Well, not talk, but you know what I mean, can communicate with each other. Individual ants can, affect each other's behavior through chemical signals and stuff like that. And in the case of robots, there are various ways that one can mediate that short-range communication. And I think another key feature is that typically there's going to be interaction between the agents, which enhances the performance of the team as a whole. Okay, so what are the benefits of swarms compared to sort of individual agents? So I think most of these benefits come from the distribution of the team, essentially. So if you have a swarm of relatively simple things compared to one larger, more complex thing, you're going to have greatly improved fault tolerance. So, looking at the biology, if an individual ant or an individual bee dies, the impact on the colony is zero, really. And similarly, in a robotic swarm, you can afford to lose some, modest number of them without really impacting the overall performance. Also, obviously, because it's a team consisting of multiple individuals, you can potentially get much better area coverage. The swarm can spread out and go, in different directions and each see a little bit of the world. in various different ways you can get the benefits of teamwork, so you might have, ants can do all sorts of really cool things by, holding onto each other, forming bridges over water and stuff like that. And while we're sort of behind that in robotics, haven't quite developed robots that are as capable as real ants, but nonetheless, a swarm of robots can potentially, cooperatively move larger objects, or perhaps more often just sort of cooperate in their sensing and exploration of the environment. Also, so there aren't really any sort of commercially available swarm robotics yet. It's very much still a field that's kind of at the research level, but I think we're going to see, as they become more mature, there's a lot of potential opportunities for cost effectiveness that come from economies of scale. So, if you were commercially manufacturing small, relatively simple swarm robots, you'd be making them in much larger numbers than you would, large complex robots. And just the way that human manufacturing systems work, it's cheaper per unit if you make lots of something rather than fewer of them. And then I suppose the final key benefit is that with the right behavioral rules, with the right control systems for these agents, you can get all sorts of really interesting emergent behavior that is sort of more complex than the behavior of the individuals, and which can potentially yield practical benefits. Okay, so, and I think it's also just sort of important in this context. So, maybe should have said this earlier, but so swarm robotics is certainly not my main research area. It's something that I've done a fair bit of work on, and I'm going to be talking about 3 of my swarm projects over the course of this talk, but I'm not an expert in it. It's one of several robotics related research areas that I work in, but yeah, so anyway, I just sort of caveat what's coming with that. But more generally, I am quite interested in, I'm very interested in biologically inspired robotics in general. I think nature offers all sorts of amazing inspiration, amazing solutions that we can benefit from trying to take inspiration from or replicate. And sort of in general, I'm quite interested in the idea of cheap and simple robots and trying to sort of see how much useful behavior we can get out of them. And I think that fits in nicely with swarm robotics, where there is a strong motivation to keep the individual agents cheap and simple. And looking at both technology and biology, I think it's very important to remember that simple does not mean inferior, right? So we have a tendency, I suppose, as humans to think of evolution over time, and of course, over the course of evolutionary time, sort of as this little graph at the bottom is trying to show, the most complex organisms now are much more complex than the most complex organisms, 500 million years ago or something like that. But all of those more simple organisms still exist. We still have bacteria, we still have protozoa and all these things. And they are actually at least as successful as us in that they've lasted a lot longer than we have. They're still around, they're still thriving. So just because more complex solutions exist doesn't make the simpler solutions worse or inferior. And also, typically a lot more resource needs to be invested in making something complex. So, if you look at relatively complex animals like ourselves or primates, we typically have only 1 or 2 offspring at a time, and, can do that maybe at best once a year. So there is a huge amount of cost invested in each baby chimpanzee or each baby human. And that means that if something happens to that baby, then the parent, the genome has lost a lot. In contrast, if you look at fish or something like that, fish, insects, those sorts of things that lay thousands of eggs at once, the cost going into each of those offspring is very, very minor. That mother fish can lay multiple clutches of eggs over a lifetime, each one 1,000 eggs or something like that. And so in that context, it doesn't really matter if 99% of those eggs get eaten by other creatures, because the remaining 10%, then maybe 1% of those will go on to become adults, and it all works out in the end because you're kind of going with a scattergun approach. And similarly in technology, if you compare a VW Beetle to a state-of-the-art BMW, I think the Beetle has its own charm, certainly, and it also has advantages in terms of repairability and, of course, cheapness of manufacture. And then if we move across to robotics, So this picture over here, I don't know if any of you know of Boston Dynamics. It's an American robotics company that does amazing work. And this robot we're seeing here is their humanoid called Atlas, which is a really amazingly capable humanoid robot. But it is also eye-wateringly expensive. And it's going to be a very, very long time, if ever, that you can buy one to do your chores for you at home. In contrast, the iRobot Roomba line of robots have sold, hundreds of thousands or probably millions of copies. And sure, it only does one thing, but it does that thing pretty well, vacuuming your floors, and it does it at a very affordable price. So, yeah, I realize that was a bit of a segue, but just sort of presenting some of my philosophy on this kind of thing. Okay, so as I said, I've only really dabbled in swarm robotics. There are all sorts of people who've made full careers out of it. But I'm going to be talking about 3 separate pieces of work here. So I'll be starting with a piece of work done by my ex-PhD student, Gabriella Rebello, who is involved in this workshop and was the one who invited me. So thank you, Gabby. So her work was of her PhD was all done in simulation, as a lot of swarm robotics work is, and that of course is a bit of a flaw when it comes to real-world application. But there are practical reasons for doing that. So her work, which I'll talk about in more detail shortly, was essentially thinking about robots trying to forage energy in order to sustain themselves in the environment. So we were simulating robots subject to energy constraints. Moving around costs them energy, and they acquire energy by seeking it out. Very simple sort of single pixel sensing that can only detect a relevant quantity in one spot where the robot is right now. And then we ended up applying a really interesting sort of evolutionary algorithms approach. I'll talk about that more when I get to it, but we were sort of looking at kind of thinking about it a bit like the evolution of species in animals. So I'll be talking about that first. Then I'll be going on to talk about work by another recently completed PhD student of mine, Simon Obute. So his work was also mostly in simulation, but with some hardware experiments around sensing specifically. And here we were sort of looking at a classic swarm robotics sort of a sample problem of foraging items from an environment, kind of akin to how ants would forage food and stuff like that. But in the end, yeah, with his work, the sort of key unique feature to it was that we made a real point of trying to take account of the imperfections in real sensor hardware. Because I think one of the issues in swarm robotics is a lot of the preliminary development is done in simulation, and people often don't take these, real world imperfections into account. And then often, if you've developed something that relies on perfect flawless sensing in simulation, then when you try to translate that to real world, real hardware, it often doesn't work. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about a piece of work that is currently still ongoing. A big research project that we're involved in called Pipebots. And of course, I'll talk about that in more detail when we get to it. But this is kind of a much more application-focused thing, trying to get towards sort of real-world deployment of swarm systems, among other things, not exclusively swarms. And as part of that, we are in the process right now of developing a small, capable, reasonably cheap to produce swarm platform that would actually be able to operate in, something resembling a real-world environment with difficult terrain and stuff. Okay, so let's go on to look at the first of those, Gabby's work on energy foraging. Okay, so the idea behind this work essentially was around a desire to have long-term autonomous robots that could be deployed into the world, with some task to do, and essentially would be able to look after themselves, sourcing energy so that they don't rely on a human to be constantly recharging their batteries, in much the same way that, animals scavenge food, and that powers them. So the context here, as I'm going to be honest, it was quite sort of abstracted and maybe a little bit contrived at times. But let's imagine that we have a swarm of robots equipped with some hardware that allows them to obtain energy from the environment. And the most feasible thing that we could think of when we were developing this work was solar. Now, of course, here's where it gets a little bit contrived. For any large-scale robot that was solar-powered, it just lies in the sun all the time and gathers energy, but that's not very interesting from a swarm robotics research point of view. So here we're kind of imagining that maybe these robots are really small, operating in, on a farm or in a jungle or something like that, such that the environment only has isolated light spots for them to seek out and use to recharge their batteries. And in the slightly further future, I mean, there is work on things like microbial fuel cells, which can, admittedly very slowly at this point, turn biological matter, like plant detritus or sewerage contents or something like that, can these microbial fuel cells can essentially use captive bacteria to generate electricity from the decomposition of these sorts of things. So, I mean, maybe in the future there would be a slightly better solution for the actual energy harvesting technique. But for now, just, come along on this on this ride with me, and let's just assume that we have a world with isolated energy sources and our robots have the capacity to harvest energy from those. Now, the biological inspiration behind our algorithm here is it's loose inspiration. There's a lot of abstraction going on, but it comes from a particular little organism that I studied, in fact, during my PhD, looking at its locomotion rather than its behavior. It's a nematode worm called Caenorhabditis elegans, or C. elegans for short. It's a tiny little worm, about 1 millimeter long, free living. There are all sorts of nematodes that are parasites, but C. elegans is not one of them. It lives in the wild. And essentially, its strategy for finding food relies on chemotaxis, like many particularly small organisms. And the way it achieves this, so it essentially, its tiny little nose at the front, unlike a dog, it can't sort of tell what direction a smell is coming from or anything like that. So essentially, the way that C. elegans finds its way to food is by following the chemical trail, and it does it as a biased random walk, where essentially it tends to move around straightish and change direction from time to time, and the probability of it changing direction depends on whether the concentration of a nice smell is getting better or worse, or whether the concentration of a bad smell, a repulsive signal, is getting worse or better. And essentially, if it's seeing an improvement in its sensor reading over time, then it reduces its probability of doing a turn. And if it's seeing a worsening of its sensor reading over time, then it increases its probability of turning. So through Gabriella's PhD, we implemented a sort of abstracted model of this C. elegans inspiration applied to our robots, and that is illustrated on the side over here. And I won't go into all of the details, but this behavioral part of the algorithm, sort of with the turns and the slowing and all of that stuff, has, at least in our first version of the model, 5 parameters which sort of configure that, how much it slows, how much the probabilities change, that kind of thing. And so then the second layer of this work involves optimization using evolutionary algorithms. So essentially, initially we create a bunch of random sets of these parameters. Then for each set, we run a simulation with this algorithm. And the goal of the simulation is essentially, the fitness function for the simulation is essentially what proportion of the robots survive for how long, because here it's all about them foraging enough energy to stay alive. And so then we get a cost or a fitness function associated with those parameters, and then the evolutionary algorithm changes the parameters and keeps iterating and iterating, trying to optimize them to maximize survival. Okay, so now in terms of the environments in which we testing these robots, you'll see an example simulation in a moment, but we wanted to try evolving these robots in different environments. So we came up with 2 sort of dimensions on which to change the quality of our environments. So we have the resource quality, which is essentially how strong on average are the light sources. So that's one of the dimensions, and then the other dimension is simpler. It's just the size of the world. The number of light sources are the same regardless of the size of the world. So basically in a bigger world, they just have to travel further to try and find their light sources. And then we combine these three different options. So for size, we've got small, medium, and large. Actual sizes don't really matter. So we combine these in a matrix with the three different levels of research quality versus the three different field sizes to yield 9 different sort of classes of environment. And then essentially we take those 9 different environments over here, and we perform that whole evolutionary optimization process separately in each of those environments. Then we go on, and this is really just done for sort of scientific interest purposes, but then we take the solutions that evolved and were found to be, best in all these different environments, and then we go and analyze their genomes. Essentially, we look at how similar or different the solutions evolved in these different environments are. So just to sort of show you kind of what the simulation looks like here. So here we have, on the top left, we have an unoptimized genome. This is just sort of a random genome from the beginning of one of these optimizations. You can see the light spots there. You can see the little robots moving around. The blue ones that are moving are still alive. The gray ones that aren't moving are dead. And obviously the redder color means higher light intensity. So, they last for a while at first. And then if we move on to an optimized genome in this particular world setup, we see that they are much more effectively finding their way to the light spots and then dwelling within them for as long as the light spots last. The sort of erratic moving back and forth that you're seeing, I mean, that comes from the fact that this is a random walk-based search. But yeah, much more effective, and they survive much longer after they've been optimized. And then just sort of for comedic purposes, really. So, optimization algorithms also throw up bad solutions sometimes. They don't keep them in the population. But this one at the bottom was the absolute worst genome that scored the lowest, lasted the least well. And as you can see, essentially what they're doing here is they're just constantly changing direction, turning back and forth, and never finding anything at all. Okay, so due to time, I can't really go too deep into this, but the final sort of step of her work was that we used some clustering algorithms, essentially, to look at the values of the 5 parameters of the optimal solution found in each of these environments, which we call the genome, being bio-inspired and all. And then we performed clustering on those to sort of identify the similarity. And we found sort of quite interesting things where, so essentially in this plot on the bottom here, we have the different environments. So that's the small rich, that's the small average, and that's the small poor, and so on. There's the large poor over there. And we looked at sort of the similarity of, well, so first we clustered all of the genomes across all of the environments. And the different colored bars here correspond to the 5 different clusters that we identified. And we then see that these clusters sort of tend to occur in different worlds. So essentially these over here are all our kind of relatively easy worlds with either small size and or rich resources. And there are 2 kind of species that we find consistently within those. Then this one over here is our absolute hardest environment, lowest resource quality and largest size. And there's this one species that mainly just occurs here. And then the red and the green species tends to occur in these sort of intermediate environments over here, which are certainly harder than these ones, but not as hard as that one. Well, I realize I'm already at half an hour, so I'm clearly waffling too much. Apologies. But anyway. But yeah, so if you're interested in that, you can find our paper on the subject. It was intriguing. I'm not entirely sure what lessons to draw from it, but nonetheless, it was interesting to see something sort of akin to the differentiation of species happening in this super simple model under evolutionary optimization. Okay, so now on to Simon's work, which was also done in simulation, but aimed a little bit more at real-world applications. So we did sort of abstract it very heavily, particularly as we went along. But the basic idea that was the starting point was, could we use a swarm of robots to pick up litter in urban environments? So that was the basic concept and context. Could we use swarm robots to find and pick up all that litter? Yeah, so then we came up with sort of a simplified model. We were using a simulation platform called Gazebo, which does include sort of physics and stuff like that, but we kept it quite simple because we were mostly interested in the actual behavior. But essentially, our individual robots are simple things with a driven wheel on each side, so they can change direction, drive forwards and stuff. And then they have a virtual camera sensor on the front. They have some sort of abstracted little gripper that allows them to pick up litter, and then they have some other sensors that I'll talk about later. And then for the purposes of our simulations, we also assumed that they had a finite carrying capacity, so they can only carry X many litter items, or just items in general, and then after that they have to go back to the nest. I will show a couple of videos later, but here's just a screenshot from one of our simulations. So for no particularly good reason, we did all of our simulations with 36 robots in the swarm. Those are these little white things over here. All the red things are the items that need to be collected. And then this thing in the middle is some sort of a nest or a base camp. So that's where the robots start, and it's also where they need to go back to drop off their litter afterwards. And as I said earlier, a key feature of this work is taking account of the noise and imperfections in real sensor hardware, trying to characterize that for real hardware to some extent, and then model those imperfections in our simulations. So Simon's work is again taking this C. elegans chemotaxis behavior as its simulation. But so in the case of Gabriella's work, the C. elegans chemotaxis was being applied to allow individual robots to find their way to energy sources. Now in this work, it's quite different. We were using that same chemotaxis-inspired approach for inter-robot communication. So our swarm is, again, very simple. The default behavior of any robot is random walk, where they move straight and then occasionally at random change direction. We gave them a camera, a virtual camera with sort of quite short detection range, so they need to get quite close to an object in order to see it, at which point they just drive towards it and pick it up. But then sort of the interesting bit with the swarm communication comes in that essentially individual robots emit signals to attract or repel other robots based on what they see. For our experiments this time, we created a bunch of different worlds. So we had two different sizes, 50 meter square and 100 meter square. The robots start at their nest in the middle in all cases. And then we were interested in the effect of sort of more clustered and less clustered distributions. So our most clustered case includes 200 items to be foraged all in one little sort of square in the corner. Our least clustered case has them just uniformly distributed in a 50 by 50 area. And then when we increase the size of the world, we leave the clusters the same size, same place, but now we have more space around them. So essentially the first thing we did was we wanted to try and find out the extent to which this robot-to-robot communication, this broadcasting of attraction and repulsion signals, the extent to which it helps the foraging efficiency. So here we've got, on the left, we've got the 50 by 50 world set. On the right, we've got the 100 by 100. And so essentially the purple bar on each of these, that's if all the robots are just independently doing random walk, running around, not talking to each other and just trying to see things, and then they go pick them up. Then on the other hand here, the orange bar is our kind of positive base, our best case baseline. Won't go into details here, but basically we used a published state-of-the-art sort of, what's it called, a route planning algorithm, the sort of thing that would be used for planning out the order of stops of a delivery driver or something like that. But basically, this is a case of centralized control, knowing where everything that needs to be picked up is, and then, optimizing the paths of the individual robots. So that's a unrealistic, I would say, best case scenario where you plan everything in advance. And then the one in the middle here, the sort of purple, well, this color, is basically our communication algorithm on top of the random walk. And as you can see, in all cases, it significantly outperforms random walk, and in the better cases comes quite close to approaching the performance of the optimized solution with global knowledge and planning and all of that. And essentially we find that in the most clustered environments, like the one with all the litter in only one cluster, that's where the difference between our algorithm and random walk is biggest. Where it's a uniform distribution of things, we still have an improvement, but it is less significant. And also, just in general, there's a slightly bigger improvement in the larger world size. Just to show you some videos quickly. So I've sped this up a lot. So this is one cluster world, 50 by 50, with just random walk. And as we can see, there's really only a few robots sort of actually finding the targets and picking them up at a time. Yeah, the rest are just sort of aimlessly running around. And we're going to see some aimless running around in the next set as well. But yeah, so there's much less coordination going on here. Most of the swarm is wasted, and also it happened quite quickly in the sped up video. But initially, it kind of took them a while to spread out and explore the whole environment. Here we've got our communication involved, and as you can see, the initial spreading out is much quicker. And then also we have more robots sort of finding their way over to the cluster of targets and being recruited by their friends. And the net result is that this one picks them all up in about half the time as the other one, maybe even less. So we're using sound for the attraction and repulsion, and then of course vision for seeing the items that need to be picked up. So we were a bit limited in terms of budget and stuff like that with Simon's PhD, so our experiment was on the basic side. But essentially we did an experiment with a little turtlebot, which is a mobile robot we had for teaching, with a laptop and a microphone. And then we had a speaker over here broadcasting sound noise. And then we had the robot approach the speaker from a distance of 15 meters and take sort of sound intensity readings. And we get this sort of exponential-ish relationship over here, but notice with quite a lot of variance. Yeah, because there's a lot of noise inherent in that. So then the other thing we looked at was modeling of imperfect vision. So Simon, sort of learned a fair bit about how computer vision works. We didn't develop any novel computer vision algorithms. We just used, state-of-the-art existing ones. And since the original context of our challenge was picking up litter, we decided to be realistic. So essentially, he downloaded a bunch of tagged images of litter from ImageNet. And that was sort of his main training source. Then he also, we've got a little park on campus. So he, responsibly mind you, he took litter and he laid it out and then he picked it up again afterwards and got more footage from a GoPro camera on mounted on a little mobile base, and essentially trained a state-of-the-art neural network to recognize litter items, which it does surprisingly well. So again, I'm seriously glossing over some stuff here, but essentially we had so many images of litter that we could not even begin to afford to tag them all ourselves for ground truth. So what we did is we used a really high performance version of this neural network trained based on the tag data that we had from ImageNet, and we essentially used that to tag all the litter in our own footage from our conditions and treated that as the baseline. And then he also implemented some much lower resolution networks, the sorts of network that you would be able to run in something resembling real time on a low-cost processor like a Raspberry Pi or something like that. And he evaluated two qualitatively different networks, Tiny YOLO v3 and MobileNet SSD, and did both of those in comparable sort of low-res sizes of 224 by 224 and 220 by 220. The slight differences are just down to the network options. And so then essentially he looked at the probability of one of these cheap, simple networks successfully detecting litter items in different sort of positions on the field of view. So over here, the green in this weird image is successful detections, and the red is missed detections. And again, sorry, there's quite a lot here, but essentially over here we've got our just random walk, or our perfect sound, or our realistic sound model data with pure vision. And then over here and over here, we've got the same three things, but with imperfect vision. And so essentially, we find that surprisingly, pleasantly surprised. Oh, and sorry, each of these numbers here is essentially the time taken to forage all the stuff, normalized by the time taken by random walk. And so if we just, for example, here compare this one to this one, we see that with perfect vision, we've gone from 1 down. We're doing this in 70% of the time, whereas with flawed vision we're doing it in 80% of the time. So so essentially we found that, of course, having imperfect vision that does not always successfully detect things does worsen your performance, but not by as much as you would think. Here's the punchline of this rather busy slide. Okay, so time for a bit of a change of pace now, moving from looking at kind of the science behind two particular PhDs to a much larger project that I'm involved in, and one that relates to swarm robotics, has elements of swarm robotics in it, but also I think is potentially highly relevant to the audience of this conference, this workshop, because of various similarities in the applications that we're tackling. So this project is called Pipebots. It actually has a much longer technical name, but we call it Pipebots. The website is pipebots.ac.uk. So this is a large interdisciplinary and collaborative project involving the universities of Sheffield, Birmingham, Bristol, and Leeds, which is where I'm from. It's funded by the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and it was a really big program grant that we got for this, close to £7 million. And essentially Pipebots is it's much more sort of application focused, industry focused than the work I've been showing you so far, and it aims to essentially develop new systems for long-term condition monitoring of buried pipe infrastructure, with a primary focus on sewer pipes and on clean water distribution pipes. So we're currently sort of in our second year of a 5-year project here. If I'm honest, progress so far has been a bit slower than we would have all liked, in large part thanks to the COVID pandemic that, kept us out of labs for quite a long time and stuff. But nonetheless, I figured it was a good thing to talk about here. So this video that I'm showing you here is an artist's conception of what a future Pipebot system might look like. This was made sort of for our outreach and public engagement and stuff near the beginning. So please don't take it too literally. This was created by artists who maybe overestimated what we can do a little bit. But nonetheless, I think it showcases the vision quite well. So essentially, under our cities, we have, thousands and thousands of kilometers of buried pipes carrying either foul water, sewerage and rainwater and stuff like that, and also sending clean water to our houses and businesses. And of course, these pipes gradually degrade. They're all sort of outliving, being forced to live longer, operate longer than they were ever really designed for. And when you have faults in these pipes, it's very hard to localize them. Water starts spilling out of the road and you don't really know where the fault is. So currently there are already robots for sort of pipeline inspection, but these are generally very big things that are hard to deploy, need to be directly operated by a person, and typically require you to sort of switch off the flow. So the vision behind Pipebots is essentially a highly capable robot swarm that can be deployed within this pipe infrastructure. The individual robots need to be sort of small enough that they don't obstruct the flow, that they can ideally sort of operate, while the pipes are still doing their thing. And yeah, I mean, I don't think the real robots we build are going to be quite as cool as these little little amphibious things that the animators came up with. But the concept is very much there. So multi-robot system communicating with each other and with the outside world, probably through some sort of communication hub that would also serve as a sort of recharging station. And essentially their role would be to monitor the condition of the pipes, help predict where failures are going to happen, tell operators if there is a critical failure somewhere that needs dealing with right now versus, something that needs maintenance within the next year or two. And in the very long term, once this research goes further and ultimately reaches higher TRLs to the point that it can be deployed even only locally in particular cities, it could really revolutionize and therefore make a lot cheaper and a lot more effective the way that we take care of this critical infrastructure. So, okay, so as I said, it's a multi-university, very large project. The project is divided into a number of research themes. So in the middle there, we've got theme 8, which is sort of more around understanding how these systems work, impacts on business operations and stuff like that. Theme 7 is also sort of a non-technical theme, looking again at how we might apply sort of better analytics and stuff like that to this kind of thing. But then at its core, it is a robotics project. So themes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all robotics. Personally, I'm involved in theme 3, which is essentially robotic hardware, robotic platforms, the robots themselves. Then we've got theme 2, which is looking at sensors, primarily sound-based, so acoustic and ultrasonic sensing, which will hopefully allow us to, do non-destructive testing, sort of detect cracks and things like that. Then we've got theme 4, which is essentially sort of autonomous control, the low-level behavior of these individual robots. We've got theme 5, which is looking at navigation, so sort of applying broadly conventional computer vision, computer navigation and mapping approaches, but trying to adapt these to the very challenging visual environment of pipes. Theme 6 is going to be looking at wireless communication between these robots and power management. So between those themes, we are looking to develop highly sensorized, fully autonomous robots at the smallest scale possible. So in terms of the kind of challenges that we face here, so in the UK, certainly degradation of our underground pipe networks is a major problem. So this is just an example of one of the many types of faults that can happen in sewer pipes. Where they crack due to expansion of the ground around them and just sort of wear and tear and age, and as you can see, those cracks can vary quite dramatically in severity. At the sort of less extreme side, the problem is that you're going to get dirty water seeping out into the surrounding ground, which is obviously bad. And then at the more extreme side, you get cracks and collapses to the point that the sewer gets blocked and, sewerage backs up into people's houses and stuff like that. In addition to, cracks and crushing, there are all sorts of other things like, sort of misaligned joints, essentially human error in the installation, buildup of fat deposits and things like that, which can block pipes. And of course, this is a very challenging environment for robots. It's sort of a semi-wet, semi-dry, so your robot would need to be amphibious. It would need to be able to deal with sludge and stuff that is not just clean water. And it's not all just straight pipes. We've got ups and downs and corners and junctions and manholes. So it's quite a challenging thing that we're trying to tackle here, and it's going to be quite a while before we solve the problem properly. Then in terms of clean water, so the examples here are quite extreme cases of bad pipes. So you can get, there are still quite a lot of metal clean water pipes in use, and they can rust and corrode through. Then biofilm buildup is a issue as well. So all our clean water pipes have biofilm on the inside, and when it's under control, it's not a major thing. It tends to sort of stay in place, doesn't contaminate the water much. But then when you get sort of rust and dirt and stuff in there as well, then that can build up with the biofilm and lead to the sort of constrictions like you're seeing in the top right there, where not much water is going to be able to get through there. And also, even a thin layer of biofilm can lead to discoloration of water and stuff like that, which customers do not like. So yeah, the clean water case is maybe even more challenging in some ways than the sewer case, because the pipes are pressurized, full of water, so we need robots that can withstand that pressure and are fully waterproof. And also, clean water distribution pipes are in many cases quite small compared to sewer pipes, which also imposes challenges around miniaturization. But yeah, I suppose it's the clean water case that more closely aligns with the theme of this workshop. It's some way that we haven't actually got any sort of working clean water demonstrators yet, but over the coming years we'll certainly be developing them. And one of the things that we're really interested in is finding collaborators who have related but in some ways maybe easier challenges. And I think, having seen some photos of the pipes in hydroelectric dams and stuff, they're potentially a good sort of waypoint for us to try and tackle, because they are bigger, maybe a bit more accessible. They're not fully sealed, so a robot might be able to swim in and stuff like that. So if there's anyone listening to this talk who is interested in discussing further and seeing if there's any way to link up with PipeBots, we already have lots of other academic partners beyond the project and also lots of industry partners, and we're always looking for more. So yeah, a little while ago, sort of mid last year, we undertook a little sort of short-term project to develop our first fully integrated PipeBot system involving contributions from all themes. This was sort of mainly done as a kind of integration exercise. So we produced our first integrated PipeBot, mid last year, I think, and here's an engineering drawing of it. So I'm in no way saying that this is a robot that's ready to go in a real sewer, but I think it's still quite an interesting one from a sort of systems integration and technological development point of view. So we built this sort of largely spherical structure for the robot so that it can turn in place inside a pipe, and then we packed it full of electronics and processors and sensing and stuff like that to support acoustic and ultrasonic sensing, visual sensing, proximity sensing with laser distance finders and stuff like that. And as I said, it's not sort of mature enough yet to go in a real sewer, so we did a sort of above ground mock-up with real sewer pipes, but without any gunk in them and without being buried underground. And it was a very useful exercise for us. Taught us a lot about what we need to do differently and better in terms of our systems integration and our individual solutions. But yeah, that's very much not sort of the long-term vision of PipeBots, because it's quite big. It sort of blocks the pipe, and it would probably struggle with more difficult terrain features like the features inside manholes and weirs and stuff like that. But we were nonetheless quite pleased to have deployed it and gathered some preliminary data from our sensors. And yeah, the locomotion of it proved reasonably decent. Our postdocs were very pleased with themselves to have finished the first deployment. But really where we're going here is more sort of small robots. So linking back to the sort of overall theme of my talk, which is swarm robotics, the swarm robot platforms that exist at the moment generally are quite simple in terms of their locomotion, wouldn't really be able to operate anywhere in the outside world. So at the moment we're working on a much more capable in terms of its locomotion swarm platform, and that's the first prototype over there. That version is just remote controlled by Bluetooth, and we're currently in the process of making a better revised version of this. So we've updated the mechanical system a bit to make it more robust and a bit easier to manufacture. It occurs to me I didn't put anything on here for scale, but it's about 60 millimeters long, this little guy. And then we're giving it a much more comprehensive electronics package with a camera, a more powerful processor to allow it to process those camera images. In the image on the right, you can see the light sources at the front. It's going to have little tactile sensors for for basic obstacle avoidance and such like. And in fact, the plan is also to look at essentially a sort of heterogeneous robot swarm kind of approach with this, or I suppose maybe a marsupial approach, where we would have lots of these small swarm robots carried by a much larger robot that can, cover longer distances more easily. And the large robot would then go and drop the swarm off in an area of interest. They would go off and gather their data, send the images back to the mother robot, and then ultimately be collected by it. Okay, so in terms of concluding thoughts, yeah, I suppose basically I'm just sort of wondering, could swarm robotics help in ecological monitoring, in tackling the challenges of invasive species that that this group is interested in? And just to reiterate, Pipebots is always looking for new partners or collaborators, so please get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss that further. Here's my email address, j.h.boyle@leeds.ac.uk. And yeah, feel free to drop me a mail if you have any general questions about my presentation, or particularly if you'd like to see about linking up with the Pipebots team. Okay, well, thanks very much for your attention, and have a great day. Bye.